Questions can be asked during the presentations, also, of course, for the online participants in the WUFA Q&A.
All right. So that's me. The only relevant thing about my background for this particular presentation is that I am the lead and have been for about 6 or 7 years on the FHIR infrastructure workflow project, which deals with a lot of the questions of how do you ask for stuff. That's a little loud. Okay, better. And so that's how I am coming into this conversation. The intention over the next 45 minutes is we will talk a little bit about the difference between what an order is, or an authorization, and what the process is for seeking fulfillment, because there's often confusion about those. We'll talk about the different mechanisms that exist in FHIR for asking people to do stuff or asking systems to do stuff, and look at how you choose between those different options, what the pros are, and some of the challenges are with each of the different options, because there's always trade-offs. That's the joy of doing anything in FHIR, is we don't give you one way to do stuff. We always give you multiple choices, and then you have to make the choices. We will look at Task, which is a special resource in the asking for stuff space, and how it's a little bit special and behaves differently than a lot of the other resources in FHIR. We'll talk about some of the patterns that exist in the FHIR resources that sort of govern the asking for stuff space. And most importantly, because I will not answer all of your questions here, I'll answer as many as I can, but you will, even if you think that you know everything when you walk out the door, then you'll actually try to do it, and there will be always more. And so we'll talk about where to get more support and how to engage with the community that talks about this all of the time, and itself doesn't necessarily have all the answers, but probably has more thoughts on things and more guidance to give than you'll find written down anywhere. So why are we talking about this now? This is a model of how sort of what the maturity process looks like for existing systems when they choose to start integrating with FHIR. And when somebody says, hey, you should make your system talk FHIR, the very first thing that they do is they start exposing content that they already have in their database as read-only, because that's the least scary thing that you can do. Nobody can break your system. Well, actually, that's not true. Depending on what query they ask for, they could break their system with read-only, but they're not going to mess up your data with read-only. And so that's the first thing that people typically do when they're exposing their system over FHIR. And the next thing that they do is people inevitably say, well, reading is great, but I want to stick stuff into the EHR from external systems. And so you expose the write once resources, things like observation, where it's data you probably don't already have, because if somebody is sending you a new blood pressure or a new body temperature or a new whatever, it's not going to be data that already exists, and it's fine for you to take that data in. It gets written once, so you don't let anybody update it ever, and that's also a relatively safe thing to do. Then we get into more fun, and we say, well, actually, I'd like to put conditions or allergies, and then I like to make changes to existing conditions and allergies. And that gets kind of dicey, because what are the rules? If you have a clinician who's created a condition, who outside the organization is allowed to come in and make changes to that? Do you create a different condition from somebody else that's saying the same thing, and how do you reconcile that? It gets messy, it's hard, and a lot of the EHRs are just thinking about how they're going to manage that process, and it's not necessarily there yet. And then we get into the really messy stuff, which is workflow. How do external systems inject orders into an EHR, or modify orders, or change the status of orders? And that's really terrifying, because if things go wrong, things go really, really wrong really fast. The good news is we're starting to be in that space. There are more and more FHIR implementations that are talking about how do I do orders, and it's not from a theoretical perspective, it's from a, yeah, I'm doing referrals in FHIR, and how do I make that happen? And so this seems like an appropriate time to have the conversation about what are the options and alternatives for making that kind of workflow happen in the FHIR space, and how do we decide what is and is not the appropriate way to do things. We ask for all kinds of stuff in healthcare. It can be prescriptions, orders for drugs or labs or imaging or whatever, formal referrals inside the organization or outside the organization, although inside is often not done in FHIR, but maybe in your environment it is, because inside versus outside is always a fun question in terms of inside the organization doesn't necessarily mean inside the application, and so you can still have inter-application exchanges. It can also be outside the order space. It can be, hey, clinician, or hey, patient, or hey, caregiver, please complete this form for me, fill out this questionnaire. Or it can be manipulating orders, so please suspend this order, or cancel this order, or discharge this patient, or just please give me a phone call. All of those things are workflow in that typically there is an ability to say yes or no. There's a process of is it done or not, possibly a need to cancel. You can even cancel the request for cancellation. It turtles all the way down. In the early stages of FHIR, around DSTU2, we recognized that, hey, we had everybody out there creating resources, and we didn't have a whole lot of consistency between those resources. And we said, you know what, we need to make that better, and we need to, we don't want to say everybody must do things the same way, because we came from that in the V3 space and it didn't work well. But we did want there to be at least a conceptual alignment between the resources, and people to do things differently because they needed to, or because it made business sense, as opposed to doing things differently because two different people were creating the different resources and they just thought about things differently. That doesn't lead to happy implementers when we have inconsistency just cause, as opposed to for good reason. So we divided much of the FHIR universe up into three patterns. The request pattern is the authorization side of things. It's service request, medication request, communication request, nutrition order. All of those things live in that space. And it's generally patient-centric. Sometimes you have requests that are not about a patient, but a lot of them are. And it's time-centric. So these are a specific authorization at a specific point in time for something to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. Then you have the events. You have the observations, you have the procedures, you have the encounters, you have conditions, although conditions are typically not things that you have requests for. In theory, a condition can still come out of a request because you ask for somebody to assess, and coming out of that, they say, well, this patient has whatever. And then we have the definitional resources, and that is something that manifests in more sophisticated systems. Could be observation definition, activity definition, plan definition, anywhere you've got a protocol that talks about what should happen, or the order in which things should happen, or what is possible to happen. Definition stuff is independent of time and independent of a particular patient or group or whatever the events and requests will be about, but might be specific in terms of what kind of resources they can be about. And then we've got relationships between all these things. So requests can be based on other requests. We'll talk about that a little later in the presentation. Events can be based on requests. So you do something, and the reason that you do it, the authorization that justified it happening, is one of the request resources. We also have the notion of replacement. So one request can replace another. So you've got a prescription, and then you have a refill prescription that sort of takes the place of the previous one. Events can exist in hierarchies as well as part of. So we have an encounter that is a part of another encounter, and a procedure that is part of an encounter, and a procedure that is part of another procedure. You can break things down that way if you need to. And we have those similar types of relationships on the definition space. There's a relationship between request and event called instantiates. That's still present in the R5 picture, but it's actually wrong because in the patterns we actually yanked instantiates and replaced it with 5 things, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But that's sort of the high-level model of how do you ask for stuff and how do you link the what was asked for to what actually happened. So in the request pattern, you probably can't read that. I can barely read that. There's a whole bunch of stuff that is at least theoretically common between the different request resources. So things like that based on relationship, the notion that orders and plans and proposals all have identifiers, typically identify the subject or the patient that they are associated with, have a code that says what is it that you're asking to have happen, has elements that indicate when you're asking for it to happen. That might be a specific date, or it might be a repeating period. There might be additional details in terms of who is supposed to do it, or where it's supposed to happen, or where it's supposed to go. And many of them also have a supporting info mechanism that lets you just send other stuff, things that the receiving system should be aware of and think about and take into account whenever it's doing what you're asking to have happen. And there's a state machine that's associated with the request resources. You can have a draft request where you're still working on it, thinking about what you're going to authorize. Then it becomes activated, and this is now something that can be acted on. It's signed, it's real. You can suspend that, reactivate it. Eventually you can say, yeah, I'm happy with that, it's done. Or we've revoked the authorization, it's no longer something that can be acted upon. And of course, everything can be marked as entered in error because, whoops, this got created against the wrong patient record. I never actually wanted Jane Smith to have this. It should have happened to Mary Smith or whatever. And so you can always do that transition. And a lot of people come and take a look at that state machine and they go, that's cool, but how do I say this is accepted? How do I say this is rejected? How do I say that this is in progress? And the answer is, you don't. That doesn't get reflected in the request resources. Instead, we have a separate resource that manages all of those questions. So this is where you will find accepted and rejected and in progress and on hold and failed and completed. You don't necessarily always go through the accepted, rejected. Sometimes there's a different process. It depends on whether the performer has a choice. Sometimes in healthcare you say, do this, change the bed sheets, and there is not an option for the custodial staff to say, no, I don't want to. They just have to. And so it's, here's an order, it's ready, go get it done. We have a received status up there that happens before accepted or rejected in those circumstances where it's an open order. I don't care who does this. Anybody who wants to take it can grab it, and somebody can sort of take custody of it and saying, mine, but I'm not committing to doing it yet. I'm just thinking about it, and I don't want anybody else to grab it while I'm thinking about it. And that then might go back to requested if they decide, you know what, I actually don't have capacity, so we'll release it to the community for somebody else to grab. But quite often you'll just have requested, and then it'll go to accepted or rejected. And so the question then is, why are you making me have another resource to manage that stuff? And the reason, there's a whole bunch of them. First of all, orders are important. They are formal authorizations by a specific individual for something to happen. So if you create a drug prescription, or you create a lab order, or you create a referral, you don't want other people messing around and changing it on you, because it's a formal legal thing. And often the process of who is going to fill this prescription, or what lab is the patient going to go to, or even what cardiologist is going to handle this particular referral, that decision isn't made at the time that the order is written, because the clinician could care less what pharmacy you grab the drug from or what lab you go to get your blood drawn from, and probably doesn't know who are the cardiologists who happen to be available that are close to the patient. That's the receptionist's problem, or the nurse's problem, or some central dispatch agency's problem that manages the who are you going to go see. And so it doesn't make sense and is legally problematic, process-wise problematic, to have an authorization that was open. Anybody who wants to dispense this drug can, whoever the patient decides or whoever the nurse decides, suddenly has changed that no, this is a directed order, because it's not a directed order. Because sometimes you will go to the lab and say, hey, can you fill this lab order? And they will go, no, I can't. The order's still fine. You can go to the next lab down the street and get it done there because they actually have enough of the right kind of tube, or their phlebotomist isn't sick, or whatever the problem was with the first lab. And so there's a difference between the order being rejected and the request for fulfillment being rejected. In addition to that, sometimes there's information that gets added later in the process. So the clinician says, this needs to happen, and the nurse says, yeah, it does, but in order for it to happen, the filler needs to know this and this and this and this, and they go grab that relevant information from the chart and can provide that downstream. And sometimes there's back and forth communication of, hey, here's where things are going on, or hey, I need a bit more information, or just to let you know, the patient decided to go for 2 weeks to Tahiti, so the referral is not going to happen exactly when we intended it to be. And so task sort of serves as that middle ground where you can have that conversation without changing the formal authorization. It's the one resource in that picture of multiple event and request and definition. It's the only resource that actually satisfies both the request and the event pattern. That's not entirely true. There's one that slipped in R5 that's pretending to be both. And I'm jumping up and down saying, please don't make that happen, fix it. That's the transport resource, and hopefully we'll get that fixed in R6. But task is designed to live between both worlds, and that's why. So what does that look like in practice? I've got a referral. Clinician has signed off on it. It's active, meaning this is an active authorization. This is something that somebody can now do. It's not draft. I've signed it. It's ready to go. Clinician's probably done at this point. Patient has walked out of the room. Clinician is dealing with another patient. But somebody needs to figure out, okay, where is this going to happen? And so the nurse or the receptionist or some downstream organization says, okay, let's try and see if we can get cardiologist or lab or pharmacy or whomever, clinic 1. That's the first thing that we find in the registry that's appropriate. And we want clinic 1 to do this. So they create a task and they point to the task using task.focus. I've seen some systems where they use task.basedon. That's different. Based on is about authorization to do something, and you generally don't need authorization to seek fulfillment. You might need authorization in order to suspend something. So for example, if I am saying I want to suspend this prescription, the authorization for that might be there is an order for them to be admitted to hospital. So I need to suspend the prescriptions that they're on because of this order for them to be in hospital. That would be based on. Task.focus, the task code says please fulfill. And the focus of that fulfillment is the request resource, the medication request, service request, whatever. And then we will point to the organization and say, hey, you are the owner of this task. You are the system or the individual that we want to actually perform this thing. And we will set the status of the task to requested saying, I want this to happen. And Clinic 1 will look at that task and say, that's cool, but we can't see new patients for the next 2 months because we're fully booked and you wanted this done next week. Or we don't carry that kind of medication, or we don't do that kind of test anymore, or our machine is broken. And so they will say, sorry, can't do it. The request does not change. Instead, the nurse, or sometimes the physician or somebody else says, okay, well, let's try clinic number 2. And they create another task. So same request resource, same instance, nothing has changed on the request at all, not even a new version. But we've got a new task instance, new task ID, Again, status is requested. And this time, Clinic 2 says, yep, no problem, I can do that. And then 2 days later, Tahiti's really nice, and our cardiologist decided that he needed a break, and he's gone. So while we said that we could, turns out that we can't, so yep, we're not able to execute. Request is still sitting there active. It's an order that can still be satisfied. And so the poor receptionist, doing what receptionists are often asked to do, picks up the phone yet again, talks to clinic number 3 and says, hey, can you do this? And clinic number 3 says yes. And this time, magically, they accept, and then they get the status to completed. Does that mean that the request changes? Not necessarily, because it is the placer who decides when the request is complete. And it could be that the cardiologist completes their examination, provides a report, and the ordering clinician looks at the report and says, yeah, that was useless. That's not what I really wanted you to do. You didn't answer my questions. You didn't look at the thing that I really wanted you to look at. And so they talk to the nurse yet again, and the task happens. And you find another cardiologist to execute this order until such time you get the response that you want. Or perhaps when you were seeking fulfillment, you weren't seeking fulfillment of the entire thing. You might have an order that says, I want this patient to have a CT scan on a monthly basis for the next year. That's a lot of CT scans. I'm not sure that we would often want to do that, but there are certainly things where you will say, I want this to be done on a regular basis for an extended period of time, but you don't necessarily assign all of those repetitions to one organization. I want the first fill to be at this particular pharmacy because that's on the way to the patient's daughter's dance recital, and that's where they want to get it filled, and so you route it there. And the next one might get filled somewhere else, and the next one might get filled somewhere else. You're not going to mark the prescription itself as complete until all of those things have been done at the end of the year. So task allows you to sort of separate out the, I've got an active authorization from who is supposed to act on it right now and how much of it are they supposed to do. So this is the task resource. Again, you can't see much of that. Whole bunch of stuff, in part because we have that union of request resource stuff and event resource stuff. But a lot of similarities in terms of what shows up here. We do have the notion of requested performer versus actual performer. We have restriction. That's how we say, I don't necessarily want you to fulfill all of it. I want you to fulfill only a certain number of repetitions or a certain date period. Or you might have an order that says, do this for a population, but I'm going to issue a task for only a subset of that population to be acted upon by a particular performer. You can do all of that. A couple of other nifty things with requests, or sorry, with task, is this input and output notion. We have the ability to provide extra information to the downstream performer of things that they need to know. So if I want you to fill out a questionnaire, we can pass the questionnaire as an input because that lets us specify a canonical. If we're looking for fulfillment of a prescription, I might provide, here's the patient's current height and weight, or information about their kidney function, or other things that the pharmacist needs to know in order to satisfy that prescription. We can also have outputs. So this is where we might link in the report that comes back, or preliminary report, or some of the observations that are getting gathered by the pathologist. And as they're gathering information, that can come in as outputs. We have a status, which is that same state machine that I showed earlier, but we also have a business status. And that lets us communicate whatever the heck we want. So if we want to say that specimen was collected, specimen went to centrifuge 1, specimen is sitting in the freezer, or we're waiting on Dr. Jones to review the results, all of that information can live in that business status. Could be just text, could be a code. The set of codes that are relevant are defined by the business process. HL7 doesn't care what that looks like. We define the high-level status, which we expect everybody to agree on. So is it accepted or not? Is it in progress or not? That's something that is consistent across business processes. But the details of why is it suspended, or what kind of suspension is it in, or where is it at in its active process, that has flexibility. So task is special. Yes? I can, and you're going to get a mic.
The code should have some relationship with the code in the order?
Not really. So if we're using task to seek fulfillment, the code is going to say, please fulfill. And you're going to have a focus that points to the service request or the medication request or whatever. So the task code is just, please fulfill this thing. And then the details of what you're supposed to do are in the thing that it points to. Good question. So if task lives in the middle of the request and the event side, requests will generally live in the placer system, the EHR, the system that the clinician who's ordering or authorizing this thing owns. The events typically will live in the filler system, in the pharmacy. That's where they will record the dispense, or in the nursing system where they record the administration, or in the radiology system where they capture the images and the reports. But where does the task live? And the answer is it can live wherever. It can live in the placer system, in which case the filler system has to be watching for tasks that are assigned to them, and they will update it, and the placer knows when things have changed. It can live in the filler system. So the way that you ask for something to be done is you post into the filler system a new task that says, hey, can you please fulfill this thing? And that's how they become aware. And then the placer has to monitor either polling or subscribing, depending on what architecture they follow, to see what's happened. Or maybe it doesn't live in either. There's an intermediary system where the task lives, and both the placer and filler have to monitor that to see what's going on. And so you might have sort of a middle ground where lots of different EHRs post their cardiology referral tasks, and that system helps to manage and might even do the dispatching of who gets this task, and then everybody monitors that. All of those things are possible. In the specification, we actually have a set of process flow diagrams. This is the more complex of them. It is the intermediary where you've got a placer and a filler and some sort of a workflow broker. And what does that look like in terms of steps? And so we've got a whole section that goes through what are the different architectures for where can things live and who monitors and how does all of that happen. Do you have to use task? No. It is possible to just post a medication request to a system and have them act on it. But you have to do something more than just post the medication request. Because picture a scenario where I have a daughter who's having a recital, and therefore I want to pick up the prescription close to that. I don't want it to go to my regular pharmacy, but I want my regular pharmacy to be aware of the fact that this prescription exists. So ordering system may post a copy of the service request to both pharmacies. I don't want both of them to count pills because, well, it depends what the pills are for and how good they make me feel, but generally the government doesn't want them to both count pills. And so in FHIR, we have a tag element on meta.tag, and meta.tag is there for workflow process purposes, and one of the standard tags that exists is this is actionable. And the special thing with tag is that tag can change without violating signatures. So I can have a signed prescription, send it to both pharmacies, put a tag on one of them that says this is actionable, not put that tag on the other one, not break the signature. And so that's how we manage the please do this as opposed to this is for your information. We do have some real systems out there that are just presuming that if I post the record to you, you're going to do it. In a closed world where that's the only place it ever goes, and we've made that assumption, then yes, you can probably get away with that, but it's not general purpose and it's not technically conformant with how FHIR says workflow is supposed to happen. Instead of posting it to the pharmacy, I could also post it just within the EHR, and the pharmacy monitors. In order for that to work, I actually have to specify a performer in the service request. It has to be assigned, otherwise nobody knows who's supposed to do it. But that is also possible. In addition to that, we don't have to use REST at all. And a lot of people, when they start looking at workflow, will be tempted to use messaging because they've been doing V2 workflow with orders forever. Some lucky folks, unlucky folks, depending on your perspective, might have been doing the same with HL7 version 3 messaging. And so you know how to do that. You don't necessarily need task when you're doing messaging because you've got this message header that allows you to sort of convey the same information about please fulfill, and focus of the message points to the thing that you're supposed to act on, and the event code tells you that, hey, this is for your information, or this is something that I actually want you to do. And messaging also gives you a little bit of ability to say, yes, I will, no, I won't. The problem with messaging is that you have to negotiate it all. So I've talked about this at DevDays before. There's a whole lot more negotiation that happens in messaging because you have to agree on what is the package of stuff that goes in the request, what are the possible event codes that can be used, what is the package of stuff that comes back in the response. All of that is up for grabs in the messaging world. And every time you change it, you have to get everybody to agree. Whereas in the RESTful world, what you can do isn't tightly nailed down. You can post, you can put or update, and here's what you get back when you do that, and here's what the resources look like, and it's all nice and clean and simple, and there's not nearly as much negotiation involved. You could also do this via custom operations. We defined that in the early stages of workflow. We haven't seen a whole lot of people do that, except in the financial space. So please adjudicate claim. That is also a please do thing. And they've opted to use the operation mechanism there. There are also people who say, well, can't you use documents? Because referral letters, that's a document, and yes, it is. If you are telling a story, which you often want to do when making a referral, then composition and FHIR document is a nice way to tell a story, to present information in a particular order, have narrative that sort of guides a human person through, tell them what to do. The only part that sort of falls apart is that there's no workflow in document. There's nothing that says, please do this, yes I will, no I won't. And you don't want everybody who picks up a document to then pick up a scalpel or start cutting pills. And so you have to wrap the document with something else, like task or a message, in order to make that please do this process work. 2, but you've already had 1.
Should we ration him?
Well, Diego, you never know.
The first one, this applies to medication requests as well?
This applies to medication requests. Yes, so I did say service request, but yes, applies to any request
The
resource.
second one, if
service.
someone is using custom operation, it's the same as messaging. You need to negotiate this, but it's not wrong technically.
It is not wrong technically. Nobody will say you're not conformant because you did messaging. Nobody will say you're not conformant because you did a custom operation. It's just your ability to do it consistently across jurisdictions, across different business cases is going to be iffy. I mean, if there's a standard operation defined in the core spec like there is for process claim, then you're on relatively stable ground. If you're defining a process prescription message in Argentina and somebody else defines one in Chile, then yeah, things get messy. Jose.
2 questions as well.
Yep.
Requesting a change to an order, not changing an order and say, please consider this change, but more, please change this order so that, I don't know, the overall dosage of the 2 medications is not too much, whatever. Is that a role for a task as well?
We're going to wait on that one because it's the next slide, I think.
Thank you. And the other one is, if you use a document, then you expect the document to be persisted somewhere on the server as it was sent, or do you want to consider disassembling it and just keeping the resources?
What you do with the document depends on how it gets transmitted. So if you just post a document, then cool, I've got a document, I've stored it. I'm not expecting anything to happen necessarily. If I receive a document as an input to a task, whether I store it myself or I just traverse the reference, or I traverse the reference, grab all the resources, create my own copies of them, depends on how my system prefers to process workflow and depends on what the task is asking me to do. If I get it inside of a message, then Lord only knows what happens, or an operation. You're talking not to a mic.
Small follow-up. So the document could be used as a kind of a wrapper for everything that you might need to know when fulfilling this order?
A document is, if all you're trying to do is wrap, I wouldn't bother with a document, because we're going to talk about that momentarily. There's other ways of sending, here's stuff that you might want to know. And there's other ways of getting at it. Document is really when you care about order of presentation and you want to have additional narrative that provides context. If you're telling a story, document is important. If you're just collecting a bunch of stuff together, you probably don't need document. Doesn't mean you can't use it. Lots of people do anyhow because they're used to putting everything into documents because that's how healthcare is done, right? But you don't have to, and it's overhead and might be interfering with what you're trying to accomplish. So, on to your first question, do you have to have a request? No. If all you're asking for is a change saying, please suspend this order, or please extend this order, change the expiry date to be different, earlier or later or whatever, or you're saying, please fill out a questionnaire. You can have that as a formal authorization, but if it's the admissions clerk saying, hey, you're coming in tomorrow for an appointment, can you please fill out these 15 consent forms and these 3 sets of demographics that are 3/4 identical, but fill them out anyhow because reasons, you don't need to have a service request that says do the questionnaire. You can just give them tasks and say, hey, can you do this, can you do this? And they can check them off, except for the last one where they say, you know what, I'm really tired of forms and no, I'm not filling that one out. And then you have the fun discussion when they show up and they say, well, then I can't serve you because payers or reasons or whatever. So there are processes where you don't need to have an authorization and where the task that you're asking to have happen is very simple, doesn't require a complex resource to describe it, and their task by itself can be sufficient. And there your task code matters. There the task code is going to say, please fill out a form. Please change the status to suspended. Please replace the bed sheets, whatever it is, because you're not pointing at anything else. The task itself has to define what's going on. Another question? Stretch.
So, yeah. So in this case, which is the focus of the task?
So it depends on what the task is doing. If the task is saying, please suspend this, then the focus will be what is it that you are suspending. If the task is, please fill out this questionnaire, it would be nice if the focus could be the questionnaire, but the questionnaire is referenced as a canonical, and focus isn't set up to do that. So in structured data capture, at least, we've said that the task actually gets passed as an input and there isn't a focus in that case. So it depends on what you're trying to do. Good question. Sometimes you want to communicate more than just the service request. I'm asking for a cardiology consult, but when doing that, I also want to send, if we've already done an echocardiogram, here's what it looks like. We may have done an ultrasound, here's what it looks like. Here's what their various lab results have looked like. Here's past procedures, etc. And there's a few different ways of managing that. You can use request supporting info to point to those things and say, hey, I know we've got this whole huge set of information in the EHR. These are the specific things that I think you will care about and want to know about. Or if the ordering clinician doesn't do that on the request, but the nurse or whoever is dispatching goes through that process, or maybe goes through that process and adds more. So yes, the ordering clinician says you care about these things, but I know from practice that you're also going to want to see these other things. You can point to those in task.input. And if you're in REST, you just point, and the receiver of the task goes and retrieves the focal request, and then goes and retrieves the things that supporting info points to, goes and retrieves the task.inputs. If they decide they want to, looks at them, or they will go out and maybe look for more stuff, because there's nothing that stops them from asking for whatever it is that they feel that they need. There are environments where the notion of, what do you mean they're going to query my system? I don't want anybody querying my system. I will give them what they need to know because I decide what they need to know. And then when that's not enough, then they get to pick up the phone or send me a fax, and I'll eventually get back to them. And isn't healthcare wonderful today? You can still play that game, and there will be systems that will insist that you play that game because that's how sometimes their legislation is written. You have no choice but to work that way. Question? No. And so messaging is kind of, or operations is kind of where you're stuck in that circumstance because you have to transmit a package of stuff. In the RESTful world, you transmit just the task, and then you point to the other stuff, and people go and grab what they need. And the pointers that you put in supporting info is a helper, because you presumably know the stuff that you think is relevant, but they can make choices and go navigate and grab other stuff if they decide they want it. And we talked about how composition tells a story. Request resource actually has a magical attribute on it called intent, which means you can use request for a bunch of different things and you can chain them together. So we talked a little bit about before this started about order grouping. This is one of the ways of grouping orders, to have this hierarchy where you start with a proposal, and then you come up with a plan, and then you have an original order, and then the filler decides what they're actually going to do. And then if you've got a repeating order, they might create suborders that reflect this specific pill that's going to be performed on this specific with this specific meal, or this specific image that's going to happen at this specific time. And you can chain all of those things together. And it's not just a 0-to-1 relationship. You can have an order that is based on multiple plans. Typically, you wouldn't have a filler order that's based on multiple original orders, but it's theoretically possible if your business process allows it. And so you can have that many to one relationship there if you want. You won't necessarily always have proposals or plans, and sometimes you won't have an order in the middle, you have a plan, and they'll have a task that tells you to act on the plan. That's also possible. It depends whether an order is necessary or not. I did not have it in the deck, but there are other ways of grouping resources as well. There is a grouping ID. So if you have a whole bunch of things that you're ordering at once, so I've got 15 different lab tests, and I want all of them done, but they're all being ordered as part of one requisition, and the fact that they are all ordered on one requisition matters from a business perspective. You can put the same grouping identifier on them that communicates to back-end systems that, hey, these are all ordered together. They are still separate orders, though. I can complete 11 of the 14, cancel 3 of the 14, and have one of them still waiting because that got routed to a different lab and they take forever to process things. All of their states are independent. You can also use a special resource called request orchestration when you've got a collection of things that are all intertwined and they don't have independent status. So something like a chemotherapy order where you start with this and then you add this, and you're going to put these different meds in particular order for particular durations. And if you cancel one of them, no, that's not how it works. You cancel the entire chemotherapy order and you rewrite a different one. You don't just mess around with part of it. In that case, you can use request orchestration to manage that interrelated connection. In terms of what replaces instantiates, we now have 5 different extensions. We have adheres to, we have complies with, we have generated from, we have shall comply with, we have triggered by, because we realized that there were actually 5 different things that we were all using the same attribute for. And it's not helpful when you're using the same attribute to mean completely different stuff. So if you are looking in resources that used to have instantiates and don't anymore, go look for these extensions. If you see resources in R5 that still have instantiates, please use these extensions instead because they are specific and will communicate your intent, whereas the generic instantiates element is really fuzzy in terms of what you're talking about. There are FHIR pages for this. So there is a section on workflow in the core spec. There is a workflow stream on chat.phir.org, and we have regular weekly calls, not this week because DevDays, but I think we're actually meeting on Monday following. So if you have workflow questions, come ask in one of those places, and we might give you answers, or we might debate for a call or two and figure out what the answer should be. But hopefully you will come out of that process wiser and at least more consistent with what everybody else is doing. So that's what, in theory, you learned. Hopefully, you're more familiar with how to ask for stuff. And that's where you can find me, also on chat.phir.org. You can ask me a PM, but I'd prefer for you to ask on the open forum, because then more people can pile on and more people can benefit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. There was one remaining question on Hoover. I hope you can answer that after the meeting online.
I will do so.
Because we.
Hi, Hoover.
All right. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the day.